Hi, my name's Jeremy Lowe, and I'm going to be talking to you today about our organic primocane fruiting blackberry production here at KSU. So blackberries are actually the official state fruit here in Kentucky. We have a somewhat small but growing industry where it's mainly U-pick operations and also fresh market jams and jellies, that sort of thing. Again, it's small commercial production. Interest is increasing, and usually the demand for blackberries outstrips the supply here in Kentucky. So to start off a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about blackberry terminology. And so canes are what we call the stems of bramble plants, so blackberries, raspberries, that sort of thing. And they're kind of interesting in that the canes live for 2 seasons and die, but the root system is perennial. And so you can have a root system that's 10 years old, but the oldest above ground part will just be 2 years. So a first year cane that's going through its first year of growth, that's called a primocane. And so when a cane initially comes up out of the ground in the spring, that's a primocane. So that cane will then go through its first year of growth, it will overwinter, and then when it goes through its second year of growth, at that point, it's a floricane. And with most blackberries, that's when you get your fruit on them. So the first year, the primocanes are just vegetative. The second year, they leaf back out, they flower fruit, and then those canes will die. And you've, in the meantime, had new primocanes come up to replace those. And so most blackberries that most people are familiar with are floricane fruiting, but now we have some blackberries are primocane fruiting, and you may also hear them referred to as fall fruiting or everbearing blackberries. So to kind of go through some different types and cultivars of blackberries, and we have erect thorny ones, and some examples of those are Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Kiowa. Erect thornless, Apache, and Ouachita would be 2 examples. Semi-erect thornless, Hull thornless, Triple Crown, and Chester are some examples of those. Trailing blackberries, which would be boysenberries and marionberries, those actually aren't hardy to here. Those are more on the west coast in Oregon, so they won't do well here. We have primocane fruiting thorny blackberries, which were the first generation of primocane fruiting blackberries, and those are Black Magic and Primark 45 are 2 examples. And now we have also primocane fruiting thornless blackberries, which Stark Black Gem and Primark Traveler would be 2 examples of those. And so all of these are from the University of Arkansas, and we've been trialing them here at KSU for several years. And so the strongest point in these is we think they're good for farmers markets. And so the floricane crop on these will get a floricane and primocane fruiting crop. The floricane crop here in Kentucky usually comes in July, and that's true for both floricane fruiting blackberries and primocane fruiting blackberries. However, that primocane crop usually starts in August, and it will go until frost. And so I'm recording this on October 15th. After I get done with this presentation, I'm actually going to go out and harvest our blackberries. So they're still fruiting here in the middle of October here in Kentucky. And normally it's the 2nd to 3rd week of October when we finally get a killing frost that will stop production. Although last year, I think we went into early November before we got that killing frost. And so the nice thing about this is you can have fruit at a time when most other growers wouldn't have fresh, locally produced blackberries. You know, at some farmers markets, you can't sell anything that you didn't grow on your own farm. And so the benefit here is that you can have fruit at a time when most other producers wouldn't have them, and therefore you can get a little bit more money from them. And also these selections, most of them are fairly upright, and so you can get away without growing them on a trellis. So especially for organic blackberry production, you want to select a site that has good air drainage. So you want to avoid frost pockets. They prefer a deep, fertile, well-drained soil with a slightly acid pH. Although I will say blackberries are wild here in Kentucky, and so they will tolerate less optimum conditions, but when you're trying to grow them for a crop, you want them to be as happy as they can be so you can get your best production. So one of the more important things here in Kentucky is get your weeds under control before you plant. And so you can do that either by repeated tillage or by solarization if you're doing it organically. You will need to put irrigation in, and then if you're wanting to certify organic, you'll need to record on-farm activity for 3 years before you can be certified organic. And you want to avoid areas that were previously established with fruit crops that could lead to a potential of crown gall infection. And you would also ideally avoid land planted recently with solanaceous crops, which would be tomatoes, peppers, that sort of thing, due to an increase of verticillium wilt. So again, to go back to weed control, There's several options you can use if you're controlling that organically. One is straw mulch. I have a picture here of some young plants that we put straw mulch down. That will also help hold in moisture. The issue that I found with straw over the long term is that it doesn't suppress like the really strong weeds. So, the blackberry canes have to be able to get up through the straw, so you can't put it on super thick. Well, the Johnson grass will also come up through that, and that's one of the bigger issues we have. We've tried flame cultivation. And so in the best case, I've had that not work real well. We actually had a situation where we were going out on a spring morning to try to flame, and we ended up setting the straw mulch on fire we had used the previous year. We couldn't get the fire put out, and we burned up all the irrigation in the orchard and burned all the plants to the ground. Now, they recovered, but that certainly set us back some. And so I don't use it for that reason. And again, even when I've done it and not burned the planting to the ground literally, it didn't control the weeds very well. Within a couple days, they were kind of coming back up. And so what we use mainly is cultivation. We mostly do it with hose. You can also do it. There's a piece of equipment called a weed badger that's tractor mounted that you could use. And again, I want to stress that you want to eliminate your weeds before you ever start the planting. And so you see this picture here, and it doesn't look too bad. We thought this was a pretty good site. However, this is earlier in the year. As the year got later, we noticed that we had a really bad Johnson grass problem in this area. And so that's something we've struggled with for years with it. After a couple years, you can finally get the Johnson grass kind of eliminated and better under control, but it's a struggle. And so I always recommend, especially with organic production, that you work on getting your weeds under control before you ever put your plants in. So for irrigation, what we use is T-tape or drip tape. Again, they will tolerate drought, but that will reduce your yields pretty significantly. And so they need about an inch of water a week during the growing season. So if they're not getting that through normal rainfall, last year here in Frankfort was the wettest year in recorded history. And so we didn't need to irrigate a lot that year just because it was so rainy. But if they're not getting that inch of rain a week, then you should supplement with irrigation. And it's best to irrigate throughout the entire season. So one of the benefits of these primocane fruiting blackberries is that you can cut the canes down if you don't want the floricane crop. And so you can get away without using a trellis that way. So that will save you some money in setting up the trellis. It also, to me, makes the plants easier to deal with. And so again, these will set the floricane and primocane crop. Now, they won't set a floricane crop that's as heavy as what floricane producers will. So they won't set as heavy of a crop as like something like Triple Crown. And if you let them set that floricane crop, it does negatively impact that primocane crop a little bit. And so what I always recommend to people is, if you want both those crops, I would put in some floricane producing blackberries to just get that floricane crop, and then just manage your primocane blackberries for the primocane crop, because they'll get a little bit bigger primocane crop that way. And so how you do that is you simply cut the canes down in early spring. And so you can see a picture there of the canes after I've cut them down. Usually here in central Kentucky, that's about March when I do that. I usually use a brush cutter with a blade on it is what I use to cut these down. You could, if you just got a few, you could use hand pruners. If you had a sickle bar mower, you could probably use that. What you want to avoid is getting too close to the ground and the crown of the plant. And so if you see there, I've left a couple inches of cane above ground. You don't want to cut them off at or below ground level, because you could damage that crown of the plant, which you want to avoid. And so by cutting those canes, it also provides you some disease control with regard to anthracnose, cane blight, and redneck cane borer. And so it lets you control those pests and diseases without using any pesticide, which is always something that's desirable with organic production. So another management practice I like to recommend is tipping. And so especially the earlier generations of primocane fruiting blackberries like Prime Gem and Prime Jan, what they like to do was they'd set a cane that would grow upright for 7 or 8 feet, and then it would get one cluster of fruit at the top of that cane, which would then get top heavy, and it would lean over and get on the ground, and you really don't want to have your berries on the ground. And so what you can do is tip them, and that helps keep the plants more manageable and shorter. It'll also increases your lateral growth, which increases your flowering and fruit set. And so they should be tipped twice by hand once at 15 inches and then a second time at 30 inches. And what you're doing is you're just removing that actively growing tip. So you can see if you look here in the center of the red circle, to the right side, you can see where that original growing point was, and I've simply just pinched that tip off. And so a couple of days later, you see just to the left of it, you see a new bud starting to emerge. And so at each of those leaf bases, there's a lateral bud. And so those lateral buds will start to break. And as you go further forward, you can see those starting to grow out. So where the red arrow is, that was where the old growing point was that I had pinched out. And you see where each of the yellow arrows are, where those canes, those lateral buds have broken and those canes are starting to grow. So what will happen now is each of those new lateral buds that have grown out will get a flower and fruit cluster on them. So instead of just getting the one cluster at the end of that cane, you'll now have several clusters. That also keeps the plants shorter and bushier. It keeps them more upright, off the ground better, and it makes them easier to manage. So for nutrient management, if you're growing plants organically, some people like to put legume nitrogen-fixing cover crops in the alleyways to help increase your nitrogen. The issue with that is sometimes those may attract stink bugs, which stink bugs will feed on the blackberries, which is something you want to avoid. However, whatever you use, they will need supplemental nitrogen for best production. And so when you first put the planting in, we recommend 50 pounds of nitrogen an acre for the first year. And for the second year, we recommend 100 pounds of nitrogen an acre. And you can use either manures, compost, animal byproducts, vegetable or seed meals. What we actually use is a feather, meat, bone, and blood meal called Nature Safe. That's 10-8 is the formulation we use. This is a slow release product, so 2 of that 10 of nitrogen is immediate release. The rest of it is a slow release as that product breaks down, and so that makes it more of a sustained feed. It also makes it more difficult to burn the plants with, and actually this is a Kentucky Proud product as well. So some diseases you might see in blackberries are anthracnose or cane blight. Again, that's something you can control by managing for primocane fruiting production only and cutting your canes down every year. Double blossom orange rust, you see a picture there of a plant infected with orange rust. That's actually caused by a fungus, and there's 2 different species that will cause that, and here in Kentucky we have both of them, unfortunately. And so any blackberry plants that you put in, whether they're floricane or primocane producing, make sure they're orange rust resistant, because we have such high pressure here that you'll lose the planting to it otherwise. And so if you see a plant with this, the only thing you can do is dig that plant up and destroy it quickly. So there's no way to treat this infection once it's happened. Crown gall, viruses, and fruit rot are some other potential diseases. And a good way to control those is weed control, good sanitation, not leaving a lot of dead plant material around, good airflow, and then again, you want to remove infected plants is an important part of prevention. So some pests you may see is red-necked cane borer. These will bore into the canes. It can cause the cane to weaken and break. So this is, again, another pest that you can control by managing for primocane-only production and cutting that cane down every year. Japanese beetle and June beetles, I think most people are familiar with. They feed on the fruit. Stink bugs, there's various species of stink bugs that will also feed on the fruit. You see the insect there in the center that looks a lot like a yellow jacket or a wasp. That's actually a moth, and that's raspberry crown borer. And so that will come in and lay eggs and a larva feed in the crown of the plant, and that can make your canes weak at the top and want to break off. And so we've seen those. Another pest that we have here at the farm are white-tailed deer. And so what they mainly do is they'll browse on the plants. We have a pretty high deer pressure rate here. And if once the plants are full size, they haven't done a whole lot of damage to ours. They've nipped them a little bit. If you have small plants, it would be something to be concerned about. You can try to control them with various types of electric fences, but they're kind of hard to keep out of there. The best way to control them is to just lower the number of deer around your farm. So the worst pest now that we have with the blackberries in Kentucky is spotted-winged Drosophila. So we used to say blackberries were pretty easy to grow organically in Kentucky. And then several years ago, we had spotted-winged Drosophila come in. And this is a fruit fly, but the issue with it is that with most fruit flies, they can only lay eggs and fruit that are overripe or the skin's already broken open. Spotted-winged Drosophila can lay eggs in fruit that are underripe even. You can see where that ovipositor is. It kind of looks like a sickle saw blade under magnification. And so they can use that to bore into the fruit. And so when this first came to Kentucky, it was a big concern for a lot of different fruit crops like strawberries, grapes, cherries, blueberries, and blackberries. What it's turned out to be the worst in is actually the primocane crop of blackberries, unfortunately, because that crop comes in August, and that's the height of the spotted-winged Drosophila population here in Kentucky. And so this is what you'll see. This is a blackberry here, and you can see the white kind of grain of rice looking thing is a larva or maggot. And so a lot of times, though, these are hidden inside the fruit. And so when we're taking data here in our planting, a lot of times I'll take those berries home with me and eat them after we've taken all the data on them. And I brought a bag of fruit home one evening, and I forgot to put them in the refrigerator. I woke up the next morning and thought, oh, I forgot to put those in there. I better grab them out of my bag and put them in there. And this is what I saw. And so if you look, all the little white things there on the sides are all larvae that's crawled out of those blackberries. And when I put these in here, these were nice looking berries. These weren't overripe, rotten berries. These were, berries that looked good to eat. That's why I saved them. And so, this wouldn't kill you to eat it, and I still eat berries out of the planting. But I like to tell people, if you're running a farmer's market stall and you sell berries to somebody and they take them home and all that crawls out of them, they're not coming back to your stall to buy anything from you probably ever again. And so for that standpoint, it's almost more of a perception problem. And I know, like in blueberries, kind of what they do is they'll try to get them harvested and then refrigerated and sold quickly before the larvae have a chance to get very big. And so we've had one of our researchers here look at some methods to try to control spotted-winged Drosophila organically, and say that they were using Primark Traveler, again, managed organically, and they bordered it either with pasture, essentially grass, or native perennials, and then they also treated them with organic pesticides, either Grandivo and Entrust or Entrust and Pyganic. And so what they saw so far, they're not completely finished with the study, but they didn't see a difference in either insecticide or treatment or versus control. However, they did see significantly fewer larvae in berries that were bordered by native perennials. And when I say significantly fewer, I mean statistically fewer, but really not a meaningful fewer. So if you look, these were 10 berry sample sizes. If you look at 2017, it was 12.5 larvae versus 18.5 larvae or 18.1 larvae in the two different treatments, and that's in 10 berries. And so you're essentially talking 1 to 2 larvae a berry, and that's too high. That's still a lot of larvae in there. 2018, the beginning was lower, but that was early in the year, and the populations probably hadn't really increased yet. And so, the problem is that spotted wing is difficult to control. It involves, even organically, a lot of spraying because it's a really difficult thing to control. So another issue that the fruit can have here in Kentucky is that they can be affected by hot temperatures. And so if the temperatures are over 85 degrees, it can reduce the fruit size, fruit set, and quality of the fruit on the primocanes. And this is especially true on the earlier generations like Prime Gem and Prime Jan. So in 2012, as an example, 64 out of 122 days had a daily high temperature above 85 from June through September. In that year, July had an average temperature of 91.1. And the reason I focus on July is because that's when most of the flowers for the primocane crop are blooming. And so which also kind of tends to be our hottest month of the summer. And so they're blooming and trying to set fruit during the hottest part of the year to get that fall crop. So in 2019, as a contrast, we had 83 out of 122 days over 85 degrees, and I think the average last year was 87 degrees, so it was also a very hot year. And so what does that look like? And so you see here on the left, Prime Jan, which is again one of the earlier generations of primocane fruiting blackberries. You can see they're essentially not setting fruit. You can see a couple little isolated drupelets here and there, but essentially they're not setting fruit. Primark 45, which was a later generation and one that's recommended for commercial production, you can see it's still setting fruit. And so you can just see it's a very marked difference between those two and how they're handling that heat. So if you look at the yields, and so you look at 2011, which was kind of an average temperature year, you see that Prime Jan had a yield of 921 pounds per acre, whereas Primark 45 had 3,900 pounds per acre. So you've already got a 3,000 pound per acre difference just in those two selections based on how they perform anyway. If you go over to 2012, you can see that both selections had lower yield, but you can see that, with the Prime Jan, it cut it down to 572. Primark 45, you're still getting 2,200 pounds per acre, so you're still getting kind of a meaningful yield. If you look at fruit weight, you can see, so Prime Jan, even in 2011, was a smaller fruit at 2.2 versus 3.8 grams for Primark 45. You go to 2012, and you see Primark is a little bit smaller berry than it was in 2011. You actually notice that Jan's a little bit larger. And the reason that was, it was setting so few fruit that it happened to be a little bit larger, the fruit that it did get. But I mean, it essentially was not setting any fruit in any kind of meaningful way. And so this is another reason why I like to recommend the later selections, just because these earlier ones just do not take the heat well. Another issue we can look at is winter cane death. And so this isn't as big of an issue if you're managing for primocane only production, because again, you're going to cut down what would be your floor canes in the spring. But if you're growing these for both crops, if you're getting winter death of those canes that will be your floor canes, then that's going to eliminate that floor cane crop. And so I went out a spring, I think we'd had a low temperature like 5 below zero. And I was looking at the planting that spring. I noticed there seemed to be some difference in survival. And so I went through and actually counted the canes, whether they were alive or dead, for the whole planting, and then ran some stats on that just to see if there was any differences, and I actually did see some difference. And so Primark Freedom, which is a thornless selection, which I'll talk about in a little bit, had 100% cane death. Primark 45 had 96% cane death, so again, it had a pretty high cane death. Stark Black Gem had 87%, and then Primark Traveler, which is the latest selection, had a 64% cane death. So you can see that Primark Traveler and Stark Black Gem, which are later generation blackberries, are more cold hardy than what the earlier generation ones are. So to kind of do an overview of what primocane fruiting varieties are out there now, Prime Gem and Prime Jan were the first two selections released. I don't recommend those to anybody. They've got a lot of issues. They don't set really large fruit. They don't set big crops. You've seen that they don't handle the heat very well. They also don't taste really well. They have kind of a bitter flavor to them, and there's so much better stuff now that I don't recommend those. We then have Black Magic. So Black Magic is thorny like Prime Gem and Prime Jan, which I like to mention to people because there's some people that forget that blackberries can be thorny. It sets a good crop. It has a nice size berry. The issue with it is it's soft. And so if you're doing like a U-pick or on-farm sales, or you're just going to be using those for like a value-added thing, those will work fine. But if you're planning on shipping those berries at all, they're not going to work very well just because they're so soft. By the time you get a container filled up, the bottom ones are starting to leak. So let me go to Primark 45. This is a thorny selection, but it was intended for commercial production. And so it produces a pretty decent berry. These are much firmer, and so they will take the commercial shipping a lot better than what the other selections will. And it's also more heat tolerant. Primark Freedom was the first thornless cultivar. And so to get the thornlessness, you actually kind of have to take a couple steps back on fruit quality. And so the fruit quality on Primark Freedom is not as good as Primark 45. So then we go forward a little bit, and I've got Primark 45 again and Primark Freedom as examples. So our newest thornless one is Primark Traveler, that's for commercial production. Again, it's a very firm fruit, it'll survive shipping well. And then we have Stark Black Gem, which it produces a really, really large berry. But again, the issue with it is it's a little soft to be trying to ship it. But if you're doing on-farm sales or U-pick or just picking for value added, it would work well for that. And so this is kind of an overview over several years of just an average fruit weight in yield. just kind of give you an idea of how they compare to each other. You know, this is over different years, and I haven't run statistics or anything on it. It's just kind of for a general idea. And so you see for Prime Gem and Prime Jan, we're looking at under 3 gram berries on average, which is smaller than what you'd really like for a commercial production, in yields in the 1,400 to 1,800 pound per acre range. You go up to Black Magic. Again, this is a softer one, but a 4.2 gram berry, so a large berry, and 3,700 pounds per acre. So a markedly higher yield. You go to Primark 45, a 3.9 gram berry, again, a bigger berry, and almost 5,600 pounds per acre. And so now we're getting up to higher production. Again, for commercial production especially, you want these higher yields. Primark Freedom, so this was the first thornless one. You notice it has a berry weight of 6.3 grams. So it produces really large berries, but you also notice 760 pounds per acre. So it's just not producing very much fruit. And so I wouldn't recommend this for anybody doing production. I really don't even recommend it for backyard growers now because we have Stark Black Gem. And so then Primark Traveler is our newest one, 3.7 gram berry. Again, this is a firm berry, it'll survive shipping, and it's on average produced about 3,000 pounds per acre, which is a little bit lower than the Primark 45, but again, it's thornless, and so one, it's a lot easier to pick and a lot more pleasant to pick, having picked in both of them. And again, as you get the thornlessness, you go back a little bit on berry quality and yields to get that thornlessness. So our current trial we have was established in May of 2016, and so we've got 3 different selections. We have Stark Black Gem, we have Primark Traveler, and then APF 268, which is an advanced selection from Dr. John Clark, who's the breeder of these. And so these are in a randomized complete block design. We have 4 blocks. We have 20 plants of each cultivar. There's 2 feet between each plant, 5 feet between blocks. 8 rows are 85 feet long and 14 feet apart. We manage this using National Organic Program standards, and then we harvest it twice a week. And so these are the selections we've got. So Primark Traveler, again, there is a fruit pick, and then I've also included a picture of it growing in the field. And so you can see, you know, the druplets are kind of packed tight together. You notice it's a really round-looking berry. It's spherical compared to what a lot of other blackberries look like. We have Stark Black Gem, and so you notice that it's got a kind of a more conical shaped berry. Again, the druplets are tightly packed together, and you can notice that it's a larger fruit. So that's one of the nice things about it, is it gets a really nice large fruit. You also notice with it, the foliage is really like a dark blue-green on it, and these plants are also shorter. They're almost kind of semi-erect. However, with tipping, you can still grow these without a trellis, and I do grow them without a trellis. And then we have APF 268. And so you notice it's also kind of a conical berry. You know, we sometimes liken that to say it looks like Marge Simpson's hairdo is what, you know, some of the blackberries look like. But you'll notice with this one that the druplets are kind of more out and rounded. It almost looks more like a cluster of grapes than it does some of the other blackberries. And so that kind of looser berry is not something that's really desirable. And we'd like to have them more tightly packed so it'll survive shipping better. You may or may not be able to see, but this selection is also thorny as well. And so that's another drawback with it. And so here's the 3 fruit pictures compared. So again, you can see that Primark Traveler is more of a rounded fruit. It tends to be a little bit smaller fruit. 268 and Black Gem are larger, and Black Gem has the more tightly packed druplets in it. And so to look at a couple years of production with them, so 2017, you see that Stark Black Gem had an average berry weight of 5 grams, and so a pretty large fruit. Primark Traveler was 3.5 grams, which is still respectable, but that's smaller than what the other ones were. And APF 268 also had a berry size like close to 5 grams. You go up to 2018, which was a hotter year, and so all of them are looking at a little bit smaller berry sizes. And so we've all kind of dropped down about a 0.5 gram on our fruit size. And so you look at yields, Stark Black Gem was 2,000 pounds per acre in 2017. Primark Traveler was 1,400, and APF 268 was 2,900. And so you can see that 268 produced significantly more fruit than the other 2 selections. Then you go to 2018, a really hot year. You can see all of them had a massive reduction. Now we're down to under 1,000 pounds per acre for all of them, and there was no significant differences in them. And if you look at harvest dates, you can see that we started harvesting about August, August 3rd, 2017, August 10th in 2018, and we harvested till about the second week, 3rd of October, which was until we got a killing frost. So in summary, the primary cane fruiting blackberries are a niche market crop that we think would be good for Kentucky growers, especially those selling in farmers markets, for having midsummer fruit until frost. Again, you can mow these canes down instead of individually pruning the dead canes out, which saves you time. You also don't have to use a trellis, and there's a potential for organic production, which are attractive to growers. Primark 45 is the best thorny commercial primary fruiting selection that's currently available. Black Magic and Stark Black Gem are both selections that are suited for home gardeners, where you've got little to no shipping, again, just because of the softer berry that they just don't take the shipping as well. And then Primark Traveler is recommended if you're wanting commercial production, but you're wanting a thornless one. So, thank you.